I'm here with Trebor Scholz from the New School in New York City. And I guess we'll just start with the question of what's your take on platform-based work and crowdsourcing?
Well, I think there has been initially really an enthusiasm and genuine excitement about these new platforms because they really seem to be, and really were initially, about sharing community and resource scarcity, tapping into unused resources, etc. But what it turned out that this whole sharing thing was really a misnomer, where in fact you find that these platforms run usually or violate very many city regulation and federal laws, where user privacy is really put to question, right? So with Uber, for example, tracking one-night stands of people and other routines, and then trying to use that knowledge to create surge pricing, right, when you need it most. Then, of course, labor conditions. So with Amazon Mechanical Turk, for novice workers making, very well-educated novice workers, even making between $2 and $3 an hour. But the same is true for Crowdflower and other platforms, which are by no means a niche phenomenon. So you have, platforms like Upwork with some 10 million workers, Crowdflower 2 million workers, Amazon Mechanical Turk 500,000. So it's like these are not small niche phenomena. And so in terms of the labor conditions, they're basically over the last 40 years, there has been a broad shift, not just on platforms, obviously, but society-wide in the United States, away from employment and towards contingent work, so towards relationships like independent contract work and freelancers, day laborers, which now lost all the protections that the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 would have granted them, meaning all these things that labor unions have fought for over 100 years, social benefits, the 8-hour workday, parental leave, health insurance, all of that is lost basically overnight. And even if these workers now basically say that some of them, if you speak to an Uber driver or speak to somebody working for Handy and they happen to like their work, this is also relatively meaningless because any of their working conditions can change overnight, right? So because there's no contract, there's no parameters for their work, and we saw this is not hypothetical. We saw this in Chicago, we saw this in New York right now. Yeah, from one day to the other, let's say the fare of the taxi changes, is lowered by 15%, in Chicago by 30%. So, and all of that is then rolled over to the drivers. And so that's, of course, not a good situation, and one that I don't think is sustainable. You have over 50% of Uber drivers are leaving the company after a year. So you see that this attrition is basically showing you that that's not a sustainable business model. So there's this drive now, even from those companies, to find some kind of social solution to that, because they realize that they need to give them some kind of social benefits to even keep them. And I think I would be very careful what's happening there, because some people suggest, like Alan Kruger suggests, this third category of workers, so not the employer, not the independent worker, but the independent contractor, but the independent worker, which has some rights that were similar to employees, but which rights those exactly would be, I would be very interested in and very careful about. So I think, well, that's maybe a little bit about the situation. So there's a lot going on, right? So they're, really these companies trying to hide the fact that they are, not really tech companies and but really logistics companies, labor companies, and which are trying to hide their labor force. And it appears if they are tech companies, they basically never use the word worker, right? They are taskers or rabbits or turkers, or they have all kinds of names, but so to obfuscate the fact that they are partners. Actually driver partners, yes. their partners. So, so all of that. And then the question really to all of that is how you want to respond to that, right? So I think so I've been working on this since 2008, and I think the first years, we really just looked at a critique of the digital economy and the really sort of the dark side of digital labor. But over the last 2-3 years, this has really shifted into much more of a discussion about alternatives and also realistic alternatives. And because I think one of the main problems, I don't know, maybe even in the 21st century, is that there are so many big problems and so very few realistic alternatives. Mm-hmm. And so I think, yeah, so that's maybe, I don't know if you want to follow up on that.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about alternatives.
Well, I think you have, when you think about alternatives, you have, in a way, you are presented with a choice, right? So either you decide to put your belief in working with the government and governmental institutions, so maybe on the federal, state or municipal level. You can, work towards regulation and reform, or you can try to remove what you are doing outside of the market, right? So non-market peer production, as Jürgen Benkler has coined it, and or you can also, the third option would be that you appeal to the platform owners, to the good in their heart, and basically, let's say, as the Domestic Workers Alliance has done, write a code of work, write a code of good work, as the Domestic Workers Alliance has done, and then present that to these platform owners and say, why, wouldn't you be like to be a good person, an ethical corporate being, and abide by these rules. And then another possibility is, of course, to reinvent unions and to really find new emerging forms of solidarity with design intervention like Turkopticon or Dynamo and others. And then lastly is my proposal, which really came out of a text I wrote in 2014, which I'm labeling as platform cooperativism. And the idea there is basically to take these 21st century technologies and change their business model, their ownership model. And so take something like Uber, remove this sort of extractive company and put in a union, a cooperative, or a city, and basically, adapt the code in a creative way to reflect your own values, to not just a takeover of the technology, but to actually sort of redesign it and think about how you can design this in a way that really draws people in, and then operate it as a for-profit, yet cooperative as a cooperative model. And this has had a lot of traction. So there are now, we did a large conference in November last year. And since then, I wrote a little book which was translated into 9 languages. There are events all over Europe and also in Canada, Australia, Bangkok, in Thailand. And people are starting to think about building those operations. People write, 5-6 million euro grants to apply to do this. So we are really excited, but we also have to be realistic about the outcome and realistic about the chances of taking on these gigantic sort of multinational corporations, of course, a tall order. And so we don't really know if it will work. But a lot of people have a lot of enthusiasm about it, which I think is very important. I think enthusiasm really gets people through this sort of first stage, and then it also needs to be the rightfully skeptical scholars who contribute their, the history and who really have studied cooperativism and history. So I think they have to talk to each other, and then we really need to be very fast. And this cannot wait for like 1 or 2 years, 3 years. This really has to happen like right now, because as we are speaking here, the future of work is seeded in the streets all over the world with these companies chiseling the network effect into stone, right? So basically you have every day we wait, they establish new realities that will be very hard to change down the road.
Thank you, Trevor.
Yeah, welcome.